Today is day 8 of the 30-day challenge to read through the New Testament, and the chapters we're going to be looking at today are Luke chapter 6 through Luke chapter 13. So we're going to be starting with 8 chapters today, a little bit longer than yesterday, but I believe you're going to enjoy the reading. It is rich with teachings, with parables. Some of the teachings in the parables are already going to be familiar from what we have read in Matthew and Mark, but you're going to see them perhaps in a little bit different order, and very likely the closest to the correct chronological order of any of the Gospels, because this was one of the things that Luke was setting out to do. Both Luke, from his orderly life as a physician, to the Holy Spirit using him to present this orderly account. And again, while the readings today are from the 6 through the 13 chapters of Luke, I wanted to go back and kind of fill in some of the gaps from the first part of Luke, because we just kind of touched on Luke very quickly as we began, and there's some things I believe that are critical to our understanding. And one of those things is that Luke, of all the writers of the Gospels, is very much concerned with the Gentiles. The other 3 Gospel accounts are going to be written from a Jewish perspective to the Jews. They certainly were God's chosen people, and they were therefore the recipients, the first recipients of the good news. But Luke now is going to point out that this gospel, that this new covenant, is not just for this limited group of people, the Hebrews, but this is going to be for all the world, for the Gentiles. And the Greeks of this New Testament era certainly were interested in these things. And so now Luke is writing to give the Gentiles information and hope. And so notice how quickly he starts with this. He uses the instance where Christ's parents go to the temple to dedicate Jesus on the 8th day, and they come across a man named Simeon. Simeon was an old man who was given a promise by God. He was waiting for the salvation of Israel. And so we start picking up in verse 29, and Simeon says this when he beholds Jesus: "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you've prepared in the sight of all the people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people, Israel." And so now Luke is really pointing out something, the Holy Spirit is pointing out something that everyone needs to understand. This gospel, this new way of life, this new covenant is for everyone, including the Gentiles. Well, of course, you can imagine how happy this made the Gentiles, but you can also imagine how this may not have set as well with God's chosen people up to this point. And so there was a point in Luke chapter 4 where Jesus is speaking in a synagogue, and he tells the people this. In verse 24, "No prophet's accepted in his hometown. I assure you there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." Well, Jesus points out that even though the Jews certainly were God's chosen people because of the promises that were made through Abraham, because the Messiah himself, Jesus, was going to come through that lineage, they certainly were the chosen people. But Jesus is now pointing out that God's goodness is not limited just towards the Hebrews, towards the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, who had placed themselves under the covenant that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. There was also another covenant in effect from the very beginning with Adam and Eve, We call it the patriarchal dispensation, and a lot of times we think of that ending at Mount Sinai with the giving of the law to Moses. And for the Jews, it effectively did end, that patriarchal dispensation, and the Mosaic dispensation began. But the patriarchal dispensation did not end for the Gentiles. They were still a law unto themselves. If they did by nature what was right, they were accepted before God. And in fact, the patriarchs were this patriarchal age where God spoke to people throughout this time, primarily to the heads of the household, again, continued for the Gentiles all the way up till the time of the cross. And so there were periods of God's favor that they received if they walked in obedience to what he had for them. Even though they weren't the chosen people, they still had an opportunity to be saved and do what was right prior to that happening. But when Jesus pointed out the good things that God did through the prophets to the Sidonians, to the Syrians, or at least specific people amongst these Gentiles, well, this made the Jews really angry. In verse 28 of Luke 4, after Jesus pointed out that the prophets had healed a Sidonian woman and a Syrian man, the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of a hill that the town was built in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. See, Jesus still had the power. He was going to be able to lay his life down in the way that God wanted him to do, in the mode of sacrifice that God had pre-selected for him. And Jesus was given the right to lay down his life. He chose to do that. He did it under God's timing. Remember, thy will be done prayer in the garden. But these people really did want to kill Jesus. They were so mad at him because he actually spoke well of the Gentiles and pointed out that there were times that God favored them. Well, again, Luke is pointing these things out, and this would appeal very much to the Greeks, the Gentiles of this time. And in fact, Luke's genealogy very much would have been something that would have appealed to them. If you go back to chapter 3 of Luke, and you read in verse 23, Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph. And then Luke begins the genealogy from Jesus' birth all the way to the creation. And a lot of people think that this is Mary's lineage, not only because of the way it's worded, he was thought to be the son of Joseph, but also because he uses a lineage that was not the royal lineage, not the kingly lineage from which the Jews would have recognized the authority of. He is going back down the lineage, very likely of Mary, and this would have been something that the Gentiles, the Greeks specifically, would have appreciated because they honored the women within their society to a certain extent. They still were very, very much a patriarchal group, but very likely this is the genealogy of Mary here. Maybe Joseph's, we don't know. We do know that one genealogy, the one in Matthew, and then one genealogy, the one in Luke, they give one's of the mother and one's of the father, and we're not sure exactly which it is because we're not told. But a lot of people think because Luke was, in fact, writing with an angle that would certainly appeal to the Gentiles, that this is the reason that he had the lineage that he did. And again, he goes all the way back to Adam. And you'll notice that both David is in the lineage of both Mary and Joseph. It's just that one of the lines comes through David's son Solomon, and this lineage we're given the line that goes through David's son Nathan. And so again, all these factors go in to the understanding that God thought of everything. He was not just trying to convince the Jews of this new gospel, he was also trying to convince the Gentiles and invite them in to this new covenant. And within this book, as with all the books, we see that the love God has for all his people. And in Luke, we very much have an emphasis towards the Gentiles, probably more so than any of the other three Gospels that we read. So that's something to think about for today. Again, the reading is through chapter 6 through 13, which we really didn't touch on a lot, but you're going to read lots of doctrine within this, lots of parables within this, and you're going to get some great insights into the personality, into the love, into the compassion of Christ by reading Luke's account. I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll continue to read through, taking the proper time that's needed so that you can gain all the lessons and all the encouragement that God has for us. That's it for today. I hope we'll see you tomorrow. God bless.